Well, it is 5 o'clock on the East Coast, so thank you everybody for joining us. It is part of our Teach 250 series for teachers, and we are have a pretty interesting program for you this evening, and we really encourage you to participate with us and offer up suggestions and answer the questions and ask a lot of questions. And Bethany has all the answers, so it's going to go great. Anyway, thank you all for joining us for our National Mall Monthly Teacher Program. We have been using the idea of inspiring a more perfect union, and we're going to focus tonight on the nation's capital, kind of the development of the city and the evolution of the city. We're going to play with some maps tonight. And so our title is Inspiring a More Perfect Capital City, a play on our overall theme for the series. So have your chat boxes open, be ready to answer some questions or provide us some insights. And if you prefer to actually talk, you're allowed to. We can make it so that you get unmuted and you can contribute to the conversation that way. So we hope you will play along with us tonight. So I get to play MC, and I get to turn it over to Ranger Bethany, who gets to share with us her maps and her history. So Bethany, it's all up to you.
All right. Thank you, Ranger Jen, and thank everybody for joining us today. I usually don't sit in this room, but I thought it was pretty fitting to have sort of the current map of the National Mall and Memorial Parks behind me. And as Jen sort of mentioned, what we're going to do today is we're going to sort of look at a series of images. Most of them are maps, although there are some pictures thrown in there, just to kind of see the evolution of the mall. We'll talk about some of the decisions that were made and why they were made. And we'll look at kind of what could have been in terms of what not only the federal city, but what the National Mall could have looked like. So we're going to start, of course, with our modern day scene of the National Mall that you see here. We in the Park Service, especially in this park, often referred to the image that you're seeing here, this sort of large strip of land, as the mall. And then the National Mall essentially includes the entire national park. So from the front of the Capitol on down to the Lincoln Memorial, and then south towards the Jefferson Memorial. So all of that becomes National Mall and Memorial Parks. And then we often just refer to this green space as the mall itself. So hopefully I'm not going to confuse you a little bit as we proceed through the programs with some of the names of things. But so we'll start with our modern view here, and then we'll go to our next view of this map right here. Does anybody recognize anything in this drawing? Does anything stand out? Does anything look strange? Does anything look familiar? Does anybody want to take a guess who created this design?
Terry recognizes Roosevelt Island.
Yep. Kind of out here. If you sort of look up north here, you might recognize this is Georgetown. It's kind of a blob in this sketch. And it is a little grainy. It is kind of difficult to see, especially some of the writing.
Is this by L'Enfant?
It is a good guess, but it's actually not. It's not L'Enfant's drawing. We'll see his in a minute. This was given to L'Enfant, though, who didn't necessarily think much of it. So I think some of you have probably guessed this is the nation's capital. So this is a very early drawing or conception of what the federal city should look like. And it actually comes from Thomas Jefferson, who, when he envisions this, this capital, he sort of envisions a small federal town. He's not looking to create this large, magnificent, huge city. And if you kind of look at the sort of the layout here, we today kind of envision ourselves being between sort of the Potomac River and the Anacostia, or the eastern branch of the Potomac. But if you look at the drawing, it's actually kind of tucked between Rock Creek, the Potomac, and this is Tiber Creek. So if you're familiar with Washington, D.C. and the layout, kind of think of Constitution Avenue. So his entire federal city sits above Constitution Avenue, just before you reach up to Georgetown. And he considers it a very modest, unassuming federal town, which kind of goes along with sort of his style of government, this laissez-faire sort of style. He thought that 1,500 acres would be suitable for the nation's capital. About 300 of those acres would be used for public buildings. So you can see we've got sort of what we would call the White House or the president's house here, and then the Capitol. And then the rest of those acres would be used for roads. And then about 1,200 of those acres would be divided into lots, which would be sold and be settled. So he estimates that it could be about 2,000 lots could be created from the additional 1,200 acres. Now, to put that into perspective for you, today the city is about 43,000 acres, and just over 11,000 of those are national park land. So we kind of compare Jefferson's vision to what we have today. It's incredibly small. Now, he does leave room for expansion. If you check out these dots here, these are roads that he kind of envisions that you could make future lots out of. And so this is Jefferson's vision of what the nation's capital should look like. Now, George Washington isn't really sold on this plan. He, like some others, are sort of thinking of a more larger, more magnificent federal city. And that's where our next map comes in. Now, what I wanted to do is kind of show you the larger view. We'll zoom in here in just a minute, but there are a few things that I wanted to point out in terms of this map here. We see kind of some observations, some explanations as to why the map is designed the way it is. A few layouts or kind of statistics in terms of the length and the width of each of the streets. He throws in what he considered to be some references here. So we'll see some letters on this map. Those letters correspond to the references. And then over here, we see just a few more. So kind of having taken that into consideration, I'm going to zoom in just a little bit so that we get a little bit of a better understanding. And again, to put it into perspective for you, if we were to sort of superimpose Jefferson's map on this one, Jefferson's federal city would basically be right about here. So you can see that this is much bigger. And so if we look at this map, does anything stand out? Does anything look familiar to what we have today? Does anything look strange? Does anybody want to guess who drew this map?
I see what looks like a canal by the mall.
Yes, yeah. So we've got what ultimately becomes the Washington City Canal, which was originally meant to bring commerce as well as trade and supplies into the federal city. The canal system never worked as envisioned, and for the vast majority of its existence was kind of an open sewer.
The Potomac River seems larger.
Definitely much, much wider than what we have today. Yep.
Planned city blocks, kind of.
Yes. Yeah. So you definitely see sort of a grid system in terms of the streets being planned out here.
It looks strange that the grid cuts off at an angle.
Oh, yep. I see what you're saying. Yes. Yep. It's kind of up here, just sort of ends.
Boundary Street, right?
Yep.
I use an image in another program where you can kind of just see like the city stop and just the hills beyond with nothing on it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and the creator of this map really sort of envisioned the city kind of coming out of the wilderness. And so when you sort of think of maybe beyond that boundary line right there is forested area, you can kind of see where they're coming from.
And the diagonal streets just cutting off the city blocks.
Yes, yeah. So that diagonal street kind of overlaid over that grid system there was sort of unique to this designer. And you can see it definitely is much different than Jefferson's vision of this just grid format of kind of uniformity in size, where here we have different lots of different sizes depending upon those diagonal avenues.
Is this L'Enfant?
Yes, yeah. So this finally getting to L'Enfant. This is what is kind of referred to as the manuscript plan. It stated to about 1791. Now, this map that we're looking at here wasn't drawn specifically by L'Enfant. L'Enfant does give George Washington a map in 1791 when he meets with him in Philadelphia to go over his plan. The map stays with Washington, but it is sort of written in pencil. It bounces around for a while, and eventually it becomes hard to read. Now, there are a couple of different attempts to preserve the map, which honestly makes things worse. And so L'Enfant's original map now is in the Library of Congress in like this sealed chambers to keep it from deteriorating any further. So nobody really has access to it. But in 1887, this map was created based upon L'Enfant's map. It's not 100% accurate, but it's pretty close to what L'Enfant had envisioned for this nation's capital. And he is an individual who is born in France. He grows up in Paris. His father's an artist. He will follow in his footsteps. And then eventually during the Revolutionary War, he will come over as a volunteer to fight with the American side, essentially. Eventually, he will find himself in places such as Valley Forge. He will make connections with James Monroe, with George Washington, with Alexander Hamilton, who becomes a confidant of his throughout a good section of his life. Eventually, he will join a group of engineers, and then he will go under George Washington's staff. Later in the war, he gets wounded. He then eventually gets captured and is exchanged for another prisoner. And then after the war, he moves to New York and he opens a sort of an engineering architectural firm. And he finds himself there during George Washington's first inauguration. And he's asked to sort of prepare Federal Hall for this big event. And so Pierre L'Enfant kind of finds himself to some degree sort of in this inner circle of important individuals. And when it comes out that they are planning on building this nation's capital along the Potomac, sort of this planned city, L'Enfant writes George Washington and kind of self-promotes himself. He essentially says to Washington to plan the city in such a manner as to give an idea of the greatness of the empire, as well as to engrave in every mind that sense of respect due to a place which is the seat of supreme sovereignty. And so in L'Enfant's mind, he wants to essentially create the greatest city on earth, one that's reflective of this new nation conceived in liberty, as he would tell George Washington. Perhaps Alexander Hamilton will put in a good word for him, but whatever he says to Washington works, and Washington is going to commission him to come to Washington to settle for a time in Georgetown and to assist with the surveying of the city. Now, in L'Enfant's mind, that means I'm being brought here to design the entire federal city. And this is going to become problematic in the future, because he's not the only one out there sort of in charge of this project. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson is sort of overall in charge. And then below him is a 3-person commission made up of essentially individuals who have connections to the land in which the city's been built on. And then there's even additional surveyors, Andrew Ellicott, Benjamin Banneker will be brought in to take some, observations to help plot out this 10-mile square, which is designated as the space for the city. And so there are a lot of people involved in this project, but if you were to ask Pierre L'Enfant, he was the head guy in charge, and this is going to get him into trouble a little bit. But he creates this kind of unique plan. And if we sort of take a look at it a little bit in depth, there's some kind of interesting elements, aspects to it that we still see today. So we do have Congress, or what he considers the Congress House, sitting on the highest point in Washington, D.C. He refers to it as Jenkins Hill, although Jenkins did not own the property at that time. And he considers this hill sort of an area waiting for a monument. And then he places the president's house, which he often refers to as a palace, on a ridge overlooking Tiber Creek. So these two very important public spaces sort of hold the high grounds in this new federal city, but they're not the only part of the important plan. Another section that you definitely see here is what's labeled H. This is in Pierre L'Enfant's mind, the centerpiece. This is his Grand Avenue. And we'll talk about the Grand Avenue in just a few minutes here, but there's a couple of other things that I wanted to point out for his design. If you notice on his map, there are a number of squares and circles and triangles that are colored yellow. What L'Enfant envisioned for these, what he called squares, although they were of different shape, is he is interested in not only laying out the city, but he's trying to figure out, how do you populate the city? How do you convince people to move to Washington, D.C.? How do you convince them to build homes, to start businesses, to bring in commerce? And for him, the way that you do that is all centered around these squares and these circles and these triangles that we have here. And it might be sort of an interesting question to ask students. When you're planning a brand new city, how do you convince people to move there? Especially since there are suitable cities already out there, say a Philadelphia, perhaps a New York, which were, the capital for some time. And there's still a lot of hope being held out, especially by people in Philadelphia, that this whole entire thing is going to fall apart. And eventually the federal city will be placed in Philadelphia. And so L'Enfant is thinking about this as he's designing the city, and he comes up with kind of a unique idea. So what he wants to do is he wants to give ultimately what will be 15 states a square. All right. And on that square, he says the center of each square will admit of statues, columns, obelisks, or any other ornament such as the different states may choose to erect, to perpetuate not only the memory of such individuals whose council or military achievements were conspicuous in giving liberty and independence to the country, but also those whose usefulness hath rendered them worthy of succeeding generations, to tread in the paths of those sages or heroes whom their country has thought proper to celebrate. So the first thing after giving it to each individual state is that in that square, they would build something to commemorate someone from that state that future generations could follow. And again, another kind of interesting question you could ask your students, who would that be from your state? In addition to that, next to the square is where the residents for their members of Congress would live, okay? So now you've got members of Congress living there. And the other important aspect of it is that each of these circles and squares are within only a half a mile of each other. Sometimes it's shorter, but at maximum, it's a half a mile. And so you can see each square, each circle from where you are. You can see the one that's sort of adjacent to your neighbor, right? And the idea is that North Carolina over here, who can see Pennsylvania up here, is not going to want Pennsylvania to look better than North Carolina. So there's this healthy dose of competition going on there. And this will compel the member of Congress who's living in or next to this square to convince people to move there, to buy lots, to settle in Washington, D.C. And not only settle there, but to open taverns and to open stores and to open inns that would be representative of their individual states. And then as this is happening, each of these small towns are going to start to grow, and they're going to start to connect with the next small town over. And so what you have is the federal city growing just as the country does. And so you have all these individual towns growing, connecting with the next one. And you can kind of envision here in the federal city, if you look at the map of the country, you can see that being mirrored here in Washington, D.C. And not only are you growing it from the outside, but you're also making this a people's city. So it's reflective of the people who are being governed by these public spaces that are kind of located in the center here. So it's kind of an interesting idea, and it's all centered around these squares. It's all centered around these broad avenues, which he has kind of going through them. And it's a very interesting plan. Does it work out the way he envisions? Absolutely not. But he is convinced that it will work. Now I want to really quickly here kind of zoom in on this Grand Avenue part of L'Enfant's design, because this is kind of the one that in terms of, the park itself is pretty important. He envisions a city sort of centered around this grand open space. So he thought it was very important for people to be out in nature and to have some form of recreation. So to get away from the bustle of the city, to recharge in these spaces until you have to go back to, say, work. And this is kind of where the mall came in. Now, if you sort of look at the entire scheme for L'Enfant, the mall essentially started at the foot of the Capitol with what he considered to be congressional gardens. And it went all the way down to what he called Monument A, which at that time was meant to be a equestrian statue of George Washington. Today we know it as the Washington Monument. And then even connect up north past the canal to what he refers to as President's Park. We still call that President's Park today, but it also goes by another name, the Ellipse. And so we see a lot of L'Enfant's plans is still sort of incorporated into the city today. Now, this Grand Avenue that he envisioned right here would be about 400 feet in width and about a mile long. It would be bordered by these gardens, which you see kind of colored here in green. And then on the other side of the gardens would be homes. Now, he kind of contradicts himself in a couple of different places as to who might live in these spaces. At one point, he kind of calls them embassies. But at another time, he refers to them as state houses. So perhaps these are again, homes that members of the government would settle in along the mall itself. But the mall was supposed to be open to everyone. Unlike some of the spaces that he grew up in, say in Paris, this wasn't limited to certain classes. Everyone was open to take advantage of this great open space. He says that the Grand Avenue was a place where residents could recreate and return refreshed. The mall would give to the city from the very beginning a superior charm over most of those in the world. It's a general resort, and all along sides of which may be placed playhouses, rooms of assembly, academies, and all sorts of places which may be attracted to the learned and afforded diversion to the idle. So again, this mall part, this Grand Avenue, very important to L'Enfant's overall design of the National Mall, or excuse me, of the Federal City, this great open space. I might also point out, if you kind of look right here, see this sort of round part of the Washington City Canal. This was supposed to have been, interestingly enough, what he calls a grand cascade. And so as the water is flowing through the canal system, there would be sort of a 40-foot waterfall, where the water itself would sort of overflow and then reconnect back to the canal itself. And so there's all of these sort of gardens, ornaments, fountains, sort of placed all within the National Mall itself. Does anybody have any quick questions before we move on? So again, Pierre L'Enfant's design, 1791, referred to as the manuscript plan.
Never got cascading water, did we?
We never got, I don't know that the canal had enough water to cascade, to be honest with you. Controlling the water level sort of led to its downfall.
Yeah, that would have been pretty cool though.
All right. So again, Grand Avenue here. Okay, so we're gonna check out the next map. It looks very similar to the one that we just saw, with a couple of exceptions. You'll notice that all of those references are gone, and we're left simply with observations, as well as sort of length and width, statistics associated with the streets and the Grand Avenues. And if we pull in a little bit more, do you see anything different between the map we saw before and the map that we're looking at right now?
Numbers in the plots?
Yes, yes. You'll notice that each of those lots now are assigned a number. So when L'Enfant meets Washington in Philadelphia in August of 1791, one of the things that Washington tells him is that October, they are planning on holding an auction to sell off some of these lots. And the money they get is how they will essentially afford, it will be how they can afford to build the federal city. L'Enfant is adamantly opposed to this plan, and he tells Washington this. He thinks it's too fast. He is concerned that there's not enough time to get this plan out there. He wants it published in every newspaper in every state. He wants to give people time to absorb it, to kind of look it over, because he's concerned that if it doesn't get out to all of the states, that what you're going to have happen is that people with locals with individual interests in Washington, D.C. will be the only ones purchasing the lots. And they will be less interested in sort of settling there or beautifying the space as they will be in holding on to the space to see where all these public buildings are going to be built and then sell them for profit. And L'Enfant is concerned that his plan to populate the city will fall apart if that is the case. L'Enfant, though, is going to be overruled, and what's going to happen is that Washington's going to ask him to start producing maps, which will then be taken to Georgetown and be available for those lot auctions. And again, this is going to be problematic.
We have a few more comments. Feels like there are more boxes on this map, but it could just be the scale.
Yeah, interesting. There are less boxes, and that is going to be a concern to L'Enfant. Some of his boxes have been removed.
The dashed roads that lead out of into the city are gone.
Yep, we have a little bit of reconfiguration, realignment of some of the roads. Some of them are longer, some of them are shorter. Some of them aren't as angled as they were before.
And then we have a question.
Okay.
Why was Davy Burns so obstinate about selling his land to the federal government?
Yeah, David Burns. So David Burns owned the vast majority of the land that would ultimately become the White House as well as some of the mall. And he very much became a thorn in the side of Washington and the commissioners as he sort of put all kinds of roadblocks up in terms of selling his property. George Washington met with all of the landowners and came up with kind of an agreement. Not all of them are exactly happy with the agreement, but essentially what would happen is that some of the property would be given to the federal government. Some of the lots the owners would maintain. But the thing that kind of gets complicated, if you will, is until these lots are surveyed and until they're plotted out, these landowners are still allowed to work the land. And so if you're trying to sell these lots, you know, you see people out there working, it kind of creates an issue. And David Burns is going to hold out, and he's going to be stubborn till the end, until he's eventually kind of convinced to give up his property. So yeah, he was one of the original landowners of Washington.
Okay, Jennifer noticed the roads are named after states. Did they do this because of L'Enfant's original idea of honoring the states?
So that's a really good question. When L'Enfant's in Philadelphia, the commission is going to write to him and let him know that they have decided that the northern or the north to south streets will be numbers and the east to west streets will be letters. But they don't really say anything about the diagonal avenues that L'Enfant had plotted out. And nowhere I looked could I really find a really good source that suggested as to why each state was sort of put where they are. Now, I do think it had to do with this idea of recognizing the certain states within the federal city, instead of perhaps the squares having them in those diagonal avenues themselves. Pennsylvania Avenue, which you can kind of see is the street that runs here. It used to run over, or it used to be an old ferry road that connected a ferry with Georgetown to a ferry over here on the Anacostia, the eastern branch of the Potomac River. For L'Enfant, this was a very, very important road, not only because it kind of connected the legislative branch to the executive branch, but he saw Pennsylvania Avenue as sort of the social scene of Washington, D.C. This is where the taverns would be built. This is where the playhouses, some of the academies would be. This is also where some of the other public buildings, so the State Department, Treasury Building, and even to some degree, he kind of alludes to the fact that maybe even the courts will be placed somewhere near Pennsylvania Avenue. But you can kind of see some of the streets have a very prominent location, Pennsylvania Avenue being one, New York being another, kind of coming right through the White House here. Maryland is a very important street, goes right through the Capitol building. And then to some degree, Virginia doesn't necessarily get the prominence that the others do, but you can kind of see Virginia is also very kind of close here to the mall and to the Capitol and to the White House as well. So I do think it has to do with, at least in part, his idea of honoring the states or recognizing the states within the federal city. Yes.
Was eminent domain a thing back then?
I don't believe it was. I don't believe it was. Washington certainly wanted to make this a very fair deal. And he gives a lot to some degree. I mean, allowing them to sort of stay on the land until this whole thing sort of works itself out was something that Washington was willing to do. And so I don't believe eminent domain was considered a thing at that point. One other thing that I might point out, and it's really difficult to see when you compare these two maps, but it was important to L'Enfant that both the White House and the Capitol building actually face water. So the front of the White House in L'Enfant's plan would face the Potomac River, and the front of the Capitol building in his plan would also face the Potomac River. The river itself sort of being this water highway that would bring in commerce into the federal city. And in Ellicott's plan, he flips them. and I guess I think I should point out that this is a map that's attributed to Andrew Ellicott. So this is called the Plan of the City of Washington from 1792, and it's considered to be the first official map of Washington. So this is the one that eventually gets created to help out with future auctions of these lots. And so again, both of these public buildings are now facing outwards as opposed to in towards the mall and in towards the river. And for Ellicott, the idea would be as the city grows, it's sort of growing out to the north, to the west, to the east. And so the public buildings would face those directions there. So one of the things that I wanted to show here, if I go back really quick, we zoom in right here, you'll notice that this map says that it basically belongs to Andrew Ellicott. So Ellicott is the one that's going to get recognition for the creation of this, and to some degree, the creation of the federal city. So what happens to L'Enfant? Well, L'Enfant, who is opposed to that October lot sale, fails to produce a map. It's not entirely his fault. He chooses an engraver who had just come over from France, who has having difficulty getting the supplies he needs to make these maps. And so this first auction goes on with simply his description of the city. There's nothing visually there to show them what this plan actually looks like. And that's going to be problematic. The auction does not go well. And then that's kind of the beginning. L'Enfant's going to get himself into even more trouble when he decides that a very prominent member of Washington, the nephew of a very well-off member of the Washington, D.C. area, begins to build their house near Jenkins Hill. Well, that house that he's building happens to be in the middle of one of L'Enfant's avenues. And so L'Enfant makes the decision to simply take down this house. It hadn't been completed yet. The foundation was there and they were building the walls. And what I find sort of fascinating about the story is that L'Enfant convinces this person's own workmen to assist in the dismantling of his home. And this creates a lot of controversy. The commission is angry. The Carrolls, who are the owners of this house, are angry. And they write, the commissioners, they write to George Washington. And at this point, George Washington is kind of getting frustrated with L'Enfant. In addition to that, L'Enfant refuses to recognize the authority of the commission. He bypasses them on every occasion and goes directly to George Washington when he was supposed to route all of his designs, his plans, his thought, his process through this commission. So everyone is kind of getting annoyed with L'Enfant. Now, L'Enfant justifies all of this by saying, I was commissioned by George Washington. He is the president of the United States, the one that kind of decided that, you know, the federal city would be here. And he essentially says that, hey, look, I told this guy his home was in the middle of my avenue, and I gave him an opportunity to remove it himself. He didn't, so I did it for him. Sort of the final nail, I guess you will, in the coffin is going to be when he basically sends Washington and Jefferson this long list of grievances that he has, basically saying none of this is my fault. You know, I have this great idea and this is going to be this magnificent grand city. And eventually Washington tells him, you have got to sort of follow the rules. You've got to go through the commission. You need to create these maps, and L'Enfant refuses. And so depending upon what source you read, depending upon how you interpret both Jefferson and L'Enfant's letters, he either is fired or he resigns. Regardless of the fact, by early 1792, L'Enfant basically is off the project. He takes his papers and he leaves. And it's kind of a sad story. So here's an individual that rises pretty quickly. Within just a year, you know, this is a guy who's been employed to help design the nation's capital. And now he is off the project. There are a lot of people that are disappointed in him. And he falls kind of into despair. He doesn't have a whole lot of money for the remainder of his life. He depends upon the charity of others, such as Hamilton, such as James Monroe, to sort of help him out. And it's not going to be until much, much later, really until sort of a revitalization plan comes to be in Washington, that L'Enfant will finally kind of be redeemed in some way and get the recognition that he deserves. Now, I might point out that Washington did tell Ellicott and Jefferson that L'Enfant's name needs to be somewhere on this map. And whether they didn't understand or whether they just refused to do so, they don't do that. And so L'Enfant, again, is not going to get the credit he deserves for really sort of laying the foundation of the city that we see here.
So Terry says, Terry believes L'Enfant was used to dealing with nobility and not a commission.
It certainly could
Probably
be.
true.
Yeah, certainly could be.
And we have another question.
Mhm.
After the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia the following year, were they worried about having such important buildings so close to water?
So
Interesting idea.
yeah, it is an interesting idea, but not necessarily. Water was vital to transportation at that time. And to some degree, somebody had pointed out how wide the Potomac River was compared to what it is today. It was that eastern branch, that Anacostia section of the river, that was more vital to transportation because it was deeper and it was narrower, as opposed to the Potomac River, which is why that ferry road, to some degree, was built. But I don't think that they were considering, some of the diseases that might pop up, concerning the waterways and concerning the marshy lands that were created because of Tiber Creek. The one thing that I do always point out is this idea that Washington, D.C. was built on a swamp. It wasn't. This was basically forested area, some farmland out there as well. But the swampy area kind of develops as the city is being built. And because the Potomac is so shallow and wide, that we have all of these mud flats being created. And that's where its swampy reputation really kind of comes from. So it's a good question. It's a good thought, but nothing that I read in terms of L'Enfant, Jefferson, or Washington's letters really ever provided any concern for that.
Question, when did the canals get filled in?
So the canals would basically be gone by the 1870s. It's going to be filled in. The canal was probably, if they were thinking of diseases at that point, the canal was probably something that they began to be concerned with. Again, because the Potomac River was so shallow, keeping the water levels at a certain level was problematic. And large boats couldn't pass through. Kind of think about, the 1860s, 1870s, Washington, D.C. was still developing. There were cattle roaming the mall. There were cattle on the Washington Monument grounds. These cattle were falling in the Washington City Canal. This is where a lot of the sewage ended up. So it was very unsightly. It smelled. And, by the 1870s, the decision was made just to go ahead and fill it in. It's not working. Let's go ahead and get rid of it. It's still down there, still under Constitution Avenue, just doesn't exist as a canal anymore.
You never see fences near that canal. I would imagine at nighttime it could get kind of scary out there.
I think so. Fall in.
Fall in. What is the large building on the eastern end at the end of Massachusetts and Georgia Ave?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The only information that was ever provided by Ellicott, or even to some degree by L'Enfant, it was just a large reservation. They didn't necessarily say what was going to be on that large reservation. It was never identified. Anything that I could find, it was never identified as a certain building. Perhaps it would be parkland. The remainder of the circles and squares that weren't designated for states would be just that. These would be open park-like spaces. Again, recreation, being out in the air was very important for L'Enfant. And so it simply could be kind of a parkland. But yeah, I tried to figure out what exactly that was as well. And just a reservation. Or I guess a parklet was another word that I heard quite often. All right. I know we don't have much time left, so I'm going to move on to our next map. I guess not really a map. This is more of a painting. This is a painting by Currier and Ives, sort of what was considered to be a bird's eye view of Washington, D.C. And I'm going to give this away a little bit. So this is circa 1880. So we've jumped forward a little bit.
This is what I was thinking about when I talked about Boundary Street. This is the image that I've used before. And how that road there in the back, it just kind of ends.
Yes. And it's a very romanticized version of Washington, D.C. And it's not to scale. That's the other thing to sort of point out in the painting here. But it does kind of give kind of a really interesting idea of how the city has progressed, how it's expanded, how it's evolved, both physically as well as to some degree symbolically, especially when you focus your attention on what ultimately is the National Mall, which would have been called Mall by now, and not necessarily that Grand Avenue that L'Enfant was talking about. But what do you notice in this painting? One thing you notice is the Washington Monument is not finished. There's a great lesson to be learned there. Doesn't get finished till about 1884. So they are working on it. The canal's no longer there either. You'll notice that it is missing.
The Capitol is huge.
It sure is, kind of looms over the rest of the painting there. Yes.
Sure does, yeah. Lack of a Supreme Court building.
Yes. Yeah, so the courts would, really in terms of L'Enfant and Ellicott, neither of them really identified a specific spot for the court system. They put a lot of thought into where the executive and legislative branch would go, but not necessarily into where the judiciary branch of the government would be placed.
The bridge over the river.
Yep. So we do see that bridge, long bridge.
All the boats.
Yes. It looks really pretty.
Yes. With the little pools by the monument as I just start playing the game myself now.
Oh,
Like I
yeah,
never looked at
no.
this.
Yeah, so you notice that there are these two ponds over here. These ponds were referred to as Babcock Lake. And you can kind of see them in this image right here. So you see one there, one that's kind of behind the Washington Monument. So this was sort of remnants or kind of left over, if you will, from the Old City Canal. These were essentially carp and turtle lakes. And so one of the big concerns, especially in the 1870s, was sort of overfishing. And there was a fish commission that was established in Washington, D.C. And their job was to essentially try and figure out how to repopulate some of the fishing areas, the fishing spaces, not only in Washington, D.C., but in the country as well. And the idea would be to create these sort of carp lakes where they would stock them and with carp, and eventually sort of grow the carp and then use them to restock lakes and rivers and such. And this became a pretty popular idea. In fact, by 1880, I think like 100,000 carp were living in the Babcock Lakes, and people from all over the country were requesting shipments of these carps to their local area. So mall carp sort of became a thing at one time. These lakes
To
didn't
bring
stick
that back.
around. Yeah, they didn't stick around for very long, roughly 1878 to 1888. Eventually they would be removed.
Question about whether you could see Smithsonian Castle in that last image.
Yes. So if you look right here, you can see the Smithsonian Castle, which sits right about there. So circa about 1850, 1855, I think is when the castle was eventually completed. The other interesting thing that you might notice in this photograph is this right here. Does anybody know what this is?
I think we just got asked about it.
Oh,
Well, I'm guessing if I guessed it right. Yeah, train
yeah.
station.
Yeah, so this is the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad, which essentially crossed the mall what at about was 7th Street, 9th Street, basically where the the west building of the National
Gallery
Gallery
of
of
Art,
Art
yeah.
now sits. This
Mhm.
train shed was about 130 feet in length, and the tracks went right over the mall. And the whole idea of placing it there is that you have a lot of space. And really during the 19th century, the mall itself became less symbolic, less park-like, and more functional in nature. So instead of this sort of cohesive, long recreational space, it was sort of kind of cut up into individual parks that served the purpose of the building it was next to. And one of the things that they wanted to do to bring commerce into the city was to build a railroad somewhere where you got space on the mall, let's put it there. The problem with that was it became unsightly. There were coal stacks placed haphazardly all over the park or all over the mall. And people were getting hit by trains as they tried to cross the tracks. So the railroad was there from about 1872 to roughly 1907, when eventually they decided that this did not fit into any schemes that anyone had ever devised for this Grand Avenue or the mall, and it needs to be removed. But yeah, so you see kind of in this picture, just sort of this strange looking National Mall. Definitely a lot different than what we are used to today. If I get this picture to disappear here, there we go. Another sort of thing to point out is kind of during the Civil War, the Department of Agriculture will be established. And there will be this sort of red brick building that will be built on the mall, or kind of adjacent to the mall, which is Department of Agriculture. And one of the things that they will do is create these gardens that sort of span the mall. There was the, we'll consider the lower garden, which was next to the building, and the upper garden, which is sort of on the other side of the mall, closer to what we would think of sort of Constitution at this point. These were experimental gardens. By the 1880s, there were somewhere around 1,600 different plants and trees and flowers and crops and um, all kinds of things being grown on the National Mall for the Department of Agriculture. There would also be these laboratories, there would be greenhouses, there would be all kinds of things that would be built adjacent to this building here. And so again, the National Mall was really sort of a chain of individual parks associated with different buildings. There was no cohesiveness to it. And by 1900, 1901 to be exact, people were really sort of looking at this and sort of reimagining what L'Enfant envisioned for the nation's capital, and decided that this wasn't what the mall was supposed to have been like. This sort of forested area next to the Capitol, you've got these gardens next to Department of Agriculture, you got this train going over the mall, and the decision is made to kind of visit this and to see if it can be redesigned. Do we have any questions or comments before we move on there, Jen?
How many years was there a hospital complex? Wasn't
So
that just
yeah,
the 4 years?
yes. So I don't know if I can get this one to go away. Let's see. I put that picture on here, I think. There we go. Yes. So if you take a look at this picture, this is from 1860s, maybe during the war years, I guess. And one of the things that you see on here is Armory Square Hospital, which is this building right here. So the hospital itself will go away shortly after the war. This building, though, I think sticks around till about 1964. So it's on the mall for quite some time. But the hospital itself, not that long. This is also kind of an interesting picture because you can see the old city canal. If you look very
Great shot
closely,
of the canal. Yeah.
yep, in the background, you can see the unfinished Washington Monument. And then if you look sort of up here towards the Capitol building, you can see some of the greenhouses associated with the botanical gardens. So again, this really isn't what L'Enfant visioned. You don't even have sort of the road over here, the railroad tracks, the road. It's not even paved. It doesn't look like this magnificent federal city that L'Enfant had envisioned. The 1860s, 1870s, and even into the 1880s. Okay, let's see.
Okay, get us to 1901 and do it quick.
Yeah, I'm going to get you very quickly to 1901. So Here's an interesting picture. And I'm going to kind of fly through this one really quickly here. So the Chicago World's Fair, 1893, if I have that date correct, there is a part of it referred to as the White City. It's sort of this neoclassical design that sparks this architectural movement in the United States called the City Beautiful movement. And the idea is a lot of these older cities would use this City Beautiful neoclassical architectural design to revitalize, to revamp, beautify the space within the city. And there was a commission referred to as the Macmillan Commission. It was named after James Macmillan, a senator from Michigan. And their idea was to create the ultimate Washington. And there are three parts of this plan that I really sort of find fascinating. First, they tried to strip away the last 100 years of use on the National Mall. And if you look at the mall itself, one of the things that you're going to notice is the Smithsonian Castle is not there. This plan calls for that building to be removed and to be replaced with, again, a neoclassical marble structure, probably up here on the north side, that were designated for different museum spaces and areas of learning. And so even the castle isn't going to be protected from this new revitalization of Washington, D.C. But there are a couple of other parts that I find kind of fascinating. The first is what they referred to as the Monument Gardens. So on the Washington Monument grounds, they would build sort of these sunken gardens with these W-shaped forested areas that would be populated with elm trees. Within each of these areas, there would be walkways that would lead to these open spaces. Now, these forested areas were elevated about 40 feet. Again, the gardens themselves were kind of sunken. There would be this 400-foot stairway that went 40 feet down. And on either side of the Washington Monument, there would be an elevated fountain. And then there would be these smaller jets that would have water sort of coming out each of the different sides. Water became kind of a big deal in a lot of the Macmillan Commission plans because they recognized how hot and kind of just awful Washington, D.C. can be in the summer. And they imagined all of these water features being very interactive. So people would use them to cool off. People would use these forested spaces for shade. This is where they would stop. They would sit down. They would enjoy the views of the city. And they would just basically kind of hang out. The reason
It would
why
be broken all the time.
it would be broken all the time. Yeah, one of the things we will always encourage anyone who's building a memorial not to do is put water in it. But one of the reasons this is not created is that there's concern for the integrity of the Washington Monument. If you start removing all of this land, they fear that will become unstable. And so the monument grounds or the monument gardens never get built, which I think we're, at least in the park, kind of happy about. Whoops. Let's see if I go back here. Another sort of interesting feature that I find is an area that's called the Washington Commons. Now, this was supposed to be sort of this great recreational space within Washington, D.C. And let me see if I can find the... So the Washington Commons is to be devoted to the people as a place of recreation. A great stadium arranged for athletic contests of all kinds and for a display of fireworks on festive occasions. Ball grounds, tennis courts, open-air gymnasiums for youth, and sand piles and swings for children. The tidal basin itself should have facilities for boating and for wading and swimming in the summer and skating in the winter. And then if you look sort of in the center here, you'll notice this little sort of round structure. That was to be a memorial of some sort, perhaps a founding fathers memorial. But according to the commission, whether this memorial shall take the form of a pantheon, in which shall be grouped the statues of the illustrious men of the nation, or whether the memory of some individuals shall be honored by a monument of the first rank, may be left to future generations. At least the site will be ready. And today, of course, we know this all as the Thomas Jefferson Memorial. So this great recreational space never gets built. Way, way too expensive. Let's see if I can get rid of the, whoop. Let's see. And there was one other, let's see if I can go back. Now, one other part that I want to talk about really, really quick, Union Square, which actually does sort of exist today, although it's on a very smaller scale. And this was meant to be the beginning of the mall itself. So Union Square would have 3 statues. In the center would be Grant. On our other side would be Sheridan and Sherman. There would also be 8 fountains, again, water being a very important feature in those hot, abysmal, terrible summers that we have here in Washington. And then there would also be kind of a reflecting pool that sort of jutted out into the mall itself, which would be, again, something that people could wade in, could put their feet in, they could cool off in. This does get built to some extent, probably the only part other than the Lincoln Memorial aspect. This is really the only part of the plan that really sees itself happening, other than sort of the recreation of the mall. The other thing that I wanted to point out really quickly here is if you look at the way this plan is designed, this entire area from the White House down to the Capitol building, down to the Commons and around to the Lincoln Memorial, this was all supposed to be part of this parkland, part of the mall. It would all be one large cohesive extension of one another instead of these individual haphazard sort of created parks that we saw in the 19th century being created. Again, most of this never gets created simply because funding is never available. But what we do see is the mall created as we know it today, the Lincoln Memorial, and ultimately this will become the Jefferson Memorial that we see down here. And so this just kind of shows us a little bit of the evolution. There's all kinds of different maps and images that you could use with students in your classroom to sort of talk about not only the evolution of the physical side of Washington, D.C., but also the symbolic side as well, whether the mall should be functional, whether it should be recreational, whether it should be a civic space, whether it should be a, just a place for relaxation. There were all kinds of different ideas in terms of how these spaces could be used. And the mall itself, the park, Washington, D.C. could look very different than what it does today. All of these roadways were built for carriages, not for cars. So it would have been interesting to see, had they built this, how it would be incorporated with today's technology. How would vehicles get around these spaces? I'm not entirely sure they could, which would make another interesting aspect for the park itself.
Did you find most of these maps?
Library of Congress and National Archives. Yes,
There
you
you
can
go.
find all of them on LOC. You can also find most of the reports. So L'Enfant's letters, Jefferson's letters, Washington's letters, as well as the final report from the Macmillan Commission. Library of Congress has it all for you.
Excellent. Thank you for taking us on this comparison. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can think about doing with students about comparing, contrasting, what's changed, what hasn't. We've talked about it a lot, the idea that as the country expands and grows west, our mall went west. What was once river became land. I mean, there are all these different changes that happened. So hopefully you all yeah, we got some nice comments from the crowd here. Thank you all so much for coming and participating. Thank you, Bethany, for creating all of this. Thank you to Gabby and Aaron at the Trust for the National Mall, who I forgot to mention at the beginning. So they help us to put on this series of programs. We have one more coming for you in May. We'll get you the info. But we're gonna get I hope to have a teacher's perspective to help you figure out ways that you can use them all in your classroom. So thank you all so much for contributing and participating with us, and we hope to see you again. If you have any other questions, don't hesitate to reach out and let us know. Thank you all so much. Have a good night.
Bye, everybody.